Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined. They're real. Redondo Beach, California, July 22nd, 2015. By sunrise, one quiet block on Nelson Avenue is sealed behind tape. Inside the residence of 47-year-old attorney and reality TV personality Loredana Nessie, officers are met with the unmistakable confirmation of a homicide. What happened in that house overnight is a question that investigators will spend years dissecting, and ultimately, a jury will be asked to resolve. The first confirmed timestamp is 07:20 a.m. That's when dispatchers logged a 911 call reporting a domestic disturbance at the address. Within minutes, patrol units from Redondo Beach Police Department arrived. Standard procedure took over. The caller was separated, officers performed a sweep to secure each room, and the property was locked down for homicide investigators. What stood out right away were the quiet anomalies. The exterior of the house showed no reported forced entry. There was no shattered glass, no pried locks, no obvious break-in. For officers used to seeing chaos at violent crime scenes, this kind of order can be more unsettling. It suggested that whatever unfolded had occurred entirely within the walls of the home, between people who already had access. As the residence was cordoned off, a parallel timeline was noted. Between approximately 3:00 a.m. and 7:19 a.m., no emergency calls came from this address. That negative evidence would become central. Investigators had to ask, if violence erupted hours earlier, why did the first emergency call come at dawn? Was the delay an artifact of panic, or was it part of the crime itself? At this stage, officers did not speculate. They documented. Crime scene logs were opened, each entry noting who crossed the threshold and when. Detectives were summoned. The Los Angeles County Medical Examiner Coroner's Office was notified to prepare for intake. For the public, the victim was not just another case number. Loredana Nessie had once been an LAPD officer, later establishing herself as a criminal defense attorney. In 2014, she gained national exposure on the Sundance TV reality series Loredana Escura. Viewers knew her as outspoken and unfiltered, a woman navigating both the courtroom and the pressures of single motherhood. To the officers on scene, she was now a homicide victim. Her professional visibility added a layer of media urgency, but procedurally, the task remained the same: preserve every detail. Neighbors soon emerged onto Nelson Avenue, met by the sight of police tape stretching across the block. Some described hearing raised voices in prior weeks, but nothing unusual during the night in question. Their accounts underscored the disquiet. Whatever had happened, it hadn't spilled into the street. Inside, detectives began the first of what would be many systematic sweeps. Photographs were taken, evidence markers placed, but they held back from moving or interpreting too much before the coroner arrived. The goal was containment, not conclusions. From a forensic perspective, the opening hours of July 22nd were about locking the clock. Every action, the call at 07:20, the officer arrival within minutes, the coroner's estimated time of death window, would later be tested against testimony. These timestamps become the anchors that keep a homicide investigation from drifting into speculation. By mid-morning, the residence was under complete control of law enforcement. One adult male had been taken into custody for questioning. The victim's body would soon be transferred under chain of custody to the coroner's facility. The investigation was only hours old, but the timeline gap, the lack of forced entry, and the domestic context already marked it as a case unlike a random attack or burglary. For now, investigators could only preserve what they saw and document what they did not: the absence of a forced entry, the absence of any call for hours, the absence of witnesses outside the home. In homicide files, absence is data. Once the Nelson Avenue residence was secured, the focus shifted from the rooms of the house to the human evidence at its center. The Los Angeles County Medical Examiner Coroner was called, and the transfer of Loredana Nessie's body was handled under strict chain of custody rules. This moment is pivotal in any homicide investigation. The body itself becomes the primary scene, a record of the violence written in wounds and biological markers. The process began with identity confirmation. Standard procedure required photographic documentation before removal, bagging of the victim's hands to preserve potential trace evidence, and careful packaging of the clothing she had worn. Each step was logged, with the initials of those present signed against the time of transfer. That log would later be introduced at trial, ensuring that from the moment Loredana was taken from her home, no defense could argue mishandling or contamination. At intake, the medical examiner began a preliminary external survey. One fatal stab wound was quickly identified, located on the torso. What drew equal attention were defensive-type injuries, abrasions and cuts consistent with someone attempting to ward off an attack. At this stage, they were noted as preliminary observations, subject to confirmation during full autopsy. Forensic investigators flagged those injuries because they often challenge claims of accident. When a victim shows signs of defending themselves, investigators must consider intent. The coroner's office established a working time of death. Based on lividity, body temperature, and scene context, the estimate placed the fatal injury at approximately 3:00 a.m. on July 22, 2015. This estimate aligned with investigative suspicion that violence had erupted in the early morning hours, well before the 911 call at 7:20 a.m. That 4-hour silence, already a red flag for detectives, now had a medical anchor point. The weapon was of special interest. Prosecutors would later describe it in court as a hunting or Rambo-style knife, a blade not typical of kitchen use. While the autopsy could not identify the exact object, the wound's dimensions and depth were consistent with a large combat-style blade. This detail, when matched with items recovered from the home, would be an important link between the physical evidence and prosecutorial theory. Toxicology was standard, ordered for both alcohol and controlled substances. Results would take weeks, but early indications suggested no intoxicants at levels sufficient to explain the fatal encounter. That left investigators focusing on the physical confrontation itself rather than impairment. Beyond the mechanics of wounds, the autopsy file captured who Loredana was at the moment her life ended. A 47-year-old woman, healthy, active, with no chronic conditions that could complicate the interpretation of cause of death. For a woman who had built her life on strength, first as an LAPD officer, later as a defense attorney, the autopsy showed she had fought, even in her final moments. This stage of the case is often the hardest for families. Official reports reduce a vibrant life to charts and diagrams. For the investigators, though, those charts are essential. They draw lines that can later be tested in court against testimony. The pathologist's measured voice would eventually be heard by jurors, explaining in clinical detail why this was not a spontaneous accident, but something prosecutors argued was deliberate violence. As the body was sealed back into custody and the autopsy scheduled, the narrative shifted again. Detectives now had both a physical scene and a body scene, each pointing to the same early morning window. The question was whether the physical evidence inside the house would reinforce or contradict what the autopsy suggested. The coroner's report did not yet name an assailant. It did not weigh motive or intent. It answered only one question: how Loredana died. The other questions, why and at whose hands, were still in the investigators' notebooks. The residence on Nelson Avenue was treated as a closed system. Whoever entered, exited, touched, or moved, anything would be accounted for. With the perimeter held, the processing team worked room to room, documenting before disturbing. They photographed every surface that could show transfer, handles, frames, light switches, and established a clear path of travel so later testimony wouldn't have to guess where people were likely standing when violence occurred. Door and window hardware came first. Technicians logged latch positions and striker plate marks, then examined weathering around frames. No pry, shear, or fresh deformation was noted on the primary entry points. Glass panes were intact. That didn't prove consent or intent, but it kept the focus inside the walls. According to police reports and contemporaneous media, early notes described no reported forced entry. The house read as lived in, not ransacked. Itemization moved to potential weapons. Kitchen drawers were opened one at a time, photographed in situ, then emptied onto sterile paper for counts, measurements, and swabbing of handles. Non-kitchen blades stored elsewhere were documented separately and sealed. Prosecutors would later characterize the fatal wound as consistent with a hunting or Rambo-style knife, a detail recorded here not to dramatize, but to ensure the property inventory could be paired with the autopsy's dimensions. Where a blade was recovered, it was packaged, sealed, and logged. Where a blade type was only inferred from wound characteristics, it was marked working pending lab confirmation. Bloodstain documentation followed. The team used low-angle light and high-resolution imaging to capture edges, directionality, and satellite spatter, where present. Scenes like this produce noise, secondary transfer, contact smears, and the ordinary mess of a home. The goal was to separate patterns that speak to force from those that speak to aftermath. Where patterns suggested motion through a corridor or doorway, those routes were flagged for latent print and touch DNA. No statements were made at this stage about cleanup. Absent an official record demonstrating it, the processing notes stayed neutral and descriptive. Latent prints were developed on targeted surfaces with powder and lifting film, then photographed with scale. Touch DNA swabs were taken from handles, drawer pulls, and the edges of any blade-compatible storage. Footwear impressions, if present, were cast or lifted using electrostatic film. Every piece was labeled with date, time, and collector ID to protect chain of custody. The team also pulled control samples from surfaces unlikely to have been touched during the event to guard against lab crosstalk. Because 2015 wasn't yet saturated with doorbell cameras, detectives canvassed neighbors the old-fashioned way. They noted who had exterior CCTV, what model, the recording interval, and how long the system retained clips before overwriting. A few homes offered partial views of the street. Others had motion-activated lights without recording. Where video existed, detectives created exact time offsets to carrier time so that phone logs and any footage could be synchronized down to the minute. If a camera showed no vehicles leaving or arriving around the working window, that absence was recorded as negative evidence, not a conclusion. In homicide work, silence is a data point, not a verdict. The search warrant inventory matched each seized item to a location sketch, so in court, a juror could see not only what was collected, but precisely where it sat when found. That transparency matters. A knife photographed on a bed reads one way. A knife photographed in secured storage reads another. According to court filings and trial coverage, this house was not staged as a burglary. The geometry supported a domestic confrontation inside a locked environment. In towns like Redondo Beach, murders aren't just crimes, they tear at the fabric of a quiet community. One practical question guided the day's work. Does the physical space corroborate a struggle narrative or contradict it? Defensive-type injuries documented by the coroner would later be compared to marks on door frames, scuffs on flooring, and interrupted dust lines on furniture. If a hand slid along a wall during a fight, microtrace can record it. If a person collapsed where they were struck, blood pattern geometry can approximate it. The data aligned neatly in places. Sometimes that was the problem. Before the team signed out, supervisors reviewed the log against actual evidence seals. No gaps, no undocumented access. The residence was then released to a rotating guard schedule while lab work began. The next phase would test whether the digital record, carrier logs, and any available camera clips fit the physical story documented here, minute to minute. The physical room was mapped. Now the clock had to speak. Detectives obtained call detail records and carrier logs for the phones tied to the Nelson Avenue address and any device known to be present that morning. The first task was mechanical. Align all logs to an authoritative time base so that dispatch records, neighbor cameras, and carrier timestamps describe one unified minute-by-minute sequence. The anchor point was fixed, 7:20 a.m., July 22, 2015, when the 911 call was logged. Everything else would pivot around that minute. Time alignment sounds technical, but it is where cases succeed or fail. Investigators built a conversion sheet, carrier server time to Pacific time, CCTV overlays to the same reference, dispatch TAD entries already in local time. Where a neighbor's DVR clock ran fast or slow, the offset was measured using known events, like the arrival of marked patrol cars, and corrected. That way, when a log shows a phone idle at 0718, the nearest camera's 00716 file is understood not as a different moment, but as the same minute viewed through a clock that drifted. With the clocks reconciled, analysts graphed activity across the working overnight window leading into dawn. The CDRs showed what they always show in domestic homicides: structure, inbound calls, outbound calls, missed call state, any short-duration connections, and any voicemail registration around daybreak. According to police reports and contemporaneous media, the first documented emergency contact was at 0720 a.m. Logs before that moment did not reflect an emergency call from the residents. In digital work, absence is a data point. It is not a conclusion. Analysts asked the disciplined question, does inactivity mean sleep, shock, or intent? Carrier data answered only what it could. Investigators noted the presence or absence of routine overnight messages and calls. If a device usually chirped through the night and then went quiet until morning, that pattern was flagged. If a device usually slept at night and slept again, that was noted as well. The point wasn't to dramatize a gap, only to document whether the dark interval between the medical examiner's 3 a.m. estimate and the morning call could be explained by habit. Because 2015 falls before the near ubiquity of app-based location trails, the digital picture relied on carrier-side artifacts. Where available, sector information and handoff notes indicated whether a handset likely remained in or near the residence overnight. Precise GPS was not asserted. Era rules matter. Analysts kept their language tight, likely in sector. No evidence of travel outside local coverage. No documented device departure before the morning response. These phrases don't tell a story by themselves, but they keep the story honest. Cameras offered a second lane. Detectives traced which homes on Nelson Avenue recorded video at night, which used motion triggers, and which simply lit up a porch without saving footage. Where video existed, it was exported, hashed, and logged. After the time offset corrections were applied, investigators scanned the overnight window for vehicle ingress or egress consistent with an outsider arriving or fleeing. The review was cautious, angles were partial, resolution was residential, and shadows complicate interpretation. No camera reviewed showed clear ingress or egress that would support a stranger's approach at the critical hours. If there was movement, it did not present as a forced entry event or a street-level approach caught cleanly on lens. The combined view, carrier logs aligned to dispatch, cameras aligned to real-time, produced a digital skeleton that matched the house story. Whatever happened, happened inside. That line is factual, but not final. Analysts marked questions in the margin for interviews. If a struggle occurred around 3 a.m., and if neither phone registered emergency outreach until 07:20, what accounts for the hours in between? Panic is real. Shock is real. But so is decision-making. The investigator's job is to test every explanation against the artifacts, not to choose the most dramatic one. In towns like Redondo Beach, murders aren't just crimes. They tear at the quiet routines that make a block feel safe. This is where a human reminder belongs. When people live behind the same doors for years, privacy becomes a fortress. Privacy also means that when violence erupts indoors, there may be no witness except the data. The goal of this review is not to speculate, but to preserve dignity while acknowledging the reality of domestic homicide. The evidence often points inward. The digital work closed with documentation, not opinion. Analysts signed off on the time-based sheet, attached the hash values for exported video, and updated the evidence index so a jury could later reconstruct the overnight period minute by minute. What happened, what did not happen, and what can't be said honestly. The next step would test words against those minutes. The interview phase began only after the physical scene, the autopsy anchors, and the digital alignment were in place. That sequencing matters. Detectives wanted words they could test, not stories they had to chase. According to police reports and contemporaneous media, the live-in boyfriend, Robert Brian Reagan, described an argument that escalated into a struggle over a knife. He framed the fatal wound as accidental, the product of a chaotic moment. The account was documented, recorded, and logged against known times. Investigators broke his narrative into verifiable beats. When did the argument start? Where in the house did the contact begin? At what point did a knife become part of the dispute? Was there a retreat by either party, and for how long? Each segment was plotted on a board already marked with the 3 and 12 a.m. working time of death and the 07:20 a.m. 911 anchor. If a claimed event spanned 5 minutes, detectives asked what the phones, the lighting, or the neighbors could say about those 5 minutes. If a pause occurred, they looked for corresponding gaps or activity in the communications logs. The first pressure point was initiation. A spontaneous struggle should show disorder that spills into the environment. Scene documentation, however, showed a home without signs of forced entry, ransacking, or a third party. That fact does not resolve intent, but it narrowed explanations to what occurred between two people already inside. Interviewers kept their questions tight. Where was Loredana standing at first contact? What hand positions were involved? And how did the knife come within reach? The goal was not to elicit emotion, but to lock the geometry of the account so it could be compared to injuries and transfer. The second pressure point was sequence. The medical examiner had recorded defensive-type injuries on Loredana Nessie, consistent with attempts to ward off a blade. Detectives asked the obvious follow-up: at what moment in the boyfriend's account would those defensive injuries occur? If he described a single sudden lunge ending in a single wound, the pattern of additional abrasions and cuts required explanation. If he described a back-and-forth struggle, the house needed to carry those marks on door frames, along edges, in interrupted dust, and any such marks needed to line up with the directionality of documented bloodstain. Where his words matched the environment, the alignment was noted. Where they didn't, inconsistencies were flagged as testable, not argued. The third pressure point was timing. A working time of death near 3:00 a.m. sets the outer boundary for violence. The first documented emergency call at 07:20 a.m. fixed the morning response. Between those points, the digital review found no emergency outreach from inside the home. Interviewers did not accuse. They asked for an operational explanation. Shock is real. Panic is real. But any explanation had to coexist with the timeline and with the body's physiology. If, for example, the boyfriend claimed repeated attempts to seek help, those attempts should exist as artifacts: partial dials, abandoned connections, calls to anyone else. If he claimed he believed the injury wasn't fatal, the injury's depth and placement would be used to assess whether such a belief was credible. Detectives also spoke with neighbors and family to contextualize relationship dynamics. According to contemporaneous media, some neighbors reported prior arguments. Those remarks were logged carefully as context, not as character evidence, and used to build questions about escalation, not to suggest predisposition. If arguments were common, what differentiated this night? Did anyone hear objects moving, a door opening, or a vehicle leaving? If no one did, that silence became an additional data point to weigh against the claim of a chaotic, multi-stage struggle. The interview team maintained strict discipline on language. Terms like accident, self-defense, and intent belonged to court. In the room, they asked for actions and durations. Who reached first? How far the knife traveled? Which hand held the blade? Whether there was space or time to disengage. If he said he attempted first aid, they asked what steps, for how long, and with what materials. Those statements were then cross-checked against scene photographs: towels, sink basins, any sign of care consistent with the narrative. As the hours wore on, the investigative ledger filled with points of contact between words and artifacts. Some matched cleanly, others required strain. One line from a veteran detective lived at the bottom of the whiteboard as a guardrail. The data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. A story that fits every known fact without friction can be rehearsed. A story that fails where the evidence cannot bend is something else entirely. By the close of interviews, investigators had a map of claims that could be taken to charging attorneys. The map did not decide guilt. It decided what to test next. Phone habits in the weeks prior, the provenance and storage of non-kitchen knives inside the home, and whether any injuries on the boyfriend's body were consistent with the specific sequence he described. Each of those threads would move forward in procurement and planning analysis. Detectives now turned from interviews to the hard paper trail: what was bought, kept, and handled inside the Redondo Beach home. According to police reports and contemporaneous media, prosecutors later said the wound was consistent with a large hunting-style knife. That meant provenance was critical. Who purchased such a blade, when, and for what reason? Retail subpoenas and bank statements were pulled, searching for outdoor or cutlery vendors before July 22, 2015. Any transaction was logged as working until tied to a seized knife. Storage patterns in the home were noted. If a blade was buried in a garage bin, why was it suddenly in play during an argument? No assumptions were made. Only access and handling were mapped. Financial records were also examined. Prosecutors would later argue that custody and money disputes raised pressure in the household. Investigators simply gathered filings, attorney invoices, and calendars, testing whether those dates aligned with the 3:30 a.m. death window and the 07:20 a.m. emergency call. A medical exam of the boyfriend was taken to compare his injuries with his story of a struggle. Scratches were recorded as preliminary, not proof. Where his account didn't match marks, or where marks were absent, That absence became negative evidence. Store cameras were checked, loyalty logs compared, and any video exports preserved under chain of custody. Email and text traffic was screened for concrete mentions of weapons or threats. Ambiguities were left for court argument. In short, procurement wasn't about finding a receipt with intent written on it. It was about tracing the ordinary decisions that placed a knife within reach in the middle of a conflict. With procurement records, medical notes, and digital intervals aligned, detectives moved to the stage where evidence had to be converted into a charging theory that could withstand courtroom challenges. This is where the technical work, receipts, timestamps, and phone activity had to become a coherent narrative that explained why a fatal confrontation occurred and who bore legal responsibility. Prosecutors in Los Angeles County required investigators to connect each forensic angle into a unified chain. The morgue findings showed a stab wound consistent with a large blade. Scene processing confirmed no forced entry, eliminating the possibility of an outside assailant. Digital movement highlighted dark intervals in phone use that coincided with the suspected time of death. These were classified as confirmed or negative evidence in the working file, not speculation. Warrants had to be tightly constructed. Investigators documented custody disputes, noted prior calls for service at the Redondo Beach address, and mapped inconsistencies between testimony and trace evidence. Each line in the affidavit was backed by tangible logs, whether bank statements, phone carrier exports, or chain of custody records from seized property. The charge under review was murder. Prosecutors considered first degree, but weighed second degree based on the immediacy of the altercation versus premeditation. Interagency support was limited but precise. Local Redondo Beach police collected the initial evidence. The Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department Crime Lab provided forensic confirmation, and the District Attorney's Office reviewed admissibility. No federal agency or interstate extradition was necessary because the suspect remained within California and did not attempt flight. Still, cross-unit communication mattered. Detectives, lab technicians, and prosecutors coordinated language so that evidence described as working at collection matched confirmed once lab certified. As the file thickened, the DA's office pressed detectives to anticipate defense arguments. Was the knife grab spontaneous? Could the fatal blow be claimed as defensive? Investigators ensured medical photographs of the suspect's minor injuries were entered as preliminary evidence, not ignored, but framed alongside the disproportionality of the victim's wounds. That balance gave the charging theory durability. By the end of the review process, Los Angeles County prosecutors signed off on a second-degree murder charge. This was based on the presence of a lethal weapon in a domestic setting, the forensic alignment of time and injury, and testimony that contradicted digital logs. With the charging decision formalized, the case moved from investigative control into prosecutorial custody. As the case advanced, pretrial hearings shaped what the jury could see. Judges allowed core forensic evidence, morgue findings, scene photos, and carrier records while excluding details deemed prejudicial. Suppression motions trimmed graphic material but preserved the spine of the case, time logs, injury patterns, and statements. At trial, prosecutors built the narrative step by step. Dispatch records fixed the morning call. The coroner described a fatal stab wound with defensive injuries on Loredana Nessie, and crime scene technicians confirmed no forced entry. Digital records framed the overnight window. The defense argued chaos and self-defense, but experts pointed to wound trajectory and blood patterns that undermined that claim. Because the charge was second-degree murder, the jury only needed to find implied malice, a conscious disregard for life. In 2017, the panel convicted Robert Brian Reagan. He was sentenced to 16 years to life in prison. This ending underscores a larger truth. Domestic violence often escalates unseen until it becomes a fatal crime. Prevention and early intervention remain the only safeguards. Looking back, telling Loredana Nessie's story is a reminder that no one ever thinks love will end in violence, until it does. As someone who has walked you through this crime step by step, I hope the lesson is clear. Pay attention to red flags, trust your instincts, and know that seeking help is never weakness. Justice was served in court, but the true call is to prevent the next tragedy. What do you think communities can do better to stop these patterns before they turn deadly? If this story touched you, share your thoughts below. Tell me where you're watching from or what part resonated with you most. And if you want more true crime cases that carry lessons for everyday life, make sure to subscribe so you won't miss the next story.